All right, we're going to get started here tonight. Plane of Existence. We're looking at part 2 and the third in that series, looking at suppressing the truth and this great deception that we have that we've been discussing. And why would that truth be suppressed? What would be the motivation of suppressing this massive deception that we have and suppressing at the same time the truth of what God's Word has to say to us? And so we've been looking at some motivations for why, as people ask that question, why would anybody do that? Why would anybody go to the lengths that they would have to go to suppress that truth? And so we're looking at a couple of different motivations. Now we're going to look at the idea of ideology, and zeal without knowledge is what I've entitled the message tonight. And we find that verse in the Bible dealing with zeal without knowledge. But here are some of the motivations that we're kind of going to look at. Again, ideology, self-delusion, or just have this zealotry, and that can blind you, of course, when you're trying to look at the truth. If you have an ideology, a very strong radical ideology, often you put aside some truth so that you just concentrate on that ideology. And we see that going on in our world today in a lot of different instances that we can think of. In the media, certainly, there's a narrative out there, and then anything that contradicts that narrative, no, we don't want to hear that. Put that aside, suppress that. And a lot of that is going on right now. We know that's happening, and it's happened in the past, obviously. And so we'll look at the other things that you see there a little bit later down the road. This guy, true academic style, says ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And I don't know if you can make sense of that or not, but you can kind of understand what's being said there. It is somewhat imaginary, this plane of existence that we're on, because of people's blinding radical ideologies. Often they're looking at something totally different than the real reality that's happening. And we've talked a lot about that, but I just threw that in there for us tonight. Again, zeal without knowledge is what we'll be looking at. In the Bible, we find in Romans chapter 10, verse 2, I bear them witness, talking about the Jews, that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. They're very zealous. They're very religious. They're really into what they're talking about, but they're wrong, is what Paul says. They have rejected their Messiah. They've missed the boat. They've because of their zeal for what they believe to be true, they've completely been blinded. Paul even says they've got scales on their eyes, and they don't see the truth of who Jesus Christ truly is, that he was their Messiah, and they rejected him and had him killed. And so that is a great illustration for us here tonight about how blind we can be. And I had the picture on the beginning there of the Nazis. I mean, that's a ultimate picture of blind zealotry, right? Boy, they were really zealous about their cause, but their cause induced them to kill millions upon millions of people because of skin color, because of lifestyles, because of religious reasons. I mean, a lot of things go into that, but it just goes to show you that you can be totally blinded by your zeal or your ideology towards a certain truth. Again, Paul says, for they being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness have not submitted to the righteousness of God. I was amazed at how many different verses of scripture that you can look at and different quotes that are out there that deal with this subject of zeal without knowledge. Proverbs 19:2 says, zeal without knowledge is not good, or to act hastily and miss the way. A man's folly undermines his way, and his heart rages against the Lord. This guy says, zeal without knowledge is fire without light. And you can see it's just a lot of fire causing a lot of damage, but it's not giving you light. It's not providing one of the positive outcomes of fire. It's just all negative. Zeal without knowledge, old German proverb, is a runaway horse. Zeal without knowledge is the sister of folly, this guy says. Zeal without knowledge is like expedition to a man in the dark. And again, you can kind of get the idea. It's not a good thing. If you don't have knowledge, if you don't have an understanding, and certainly people could look at what we're talking about here in this study, the plane of existence study, and say, well, you guys are zeal without knowledge. You guys are a perfect example of that. But what I always kind of think about the idea of evolution and all the other things that we've discussed, most people have just gone to public school. They've only been taught one truth. All other truths have been hidden from their eyes. Whereas most Christians who come to an understanding of, no, all that other stuff is wrong, the Bible is true, we didn't evolve from monkeys out of the tree, God created us, God created the heavens and the earth is what the Bible says. When you can come to it after looking at all the propaganda that has been crammed down our throats and still be able to see other truths and not be blinded and only see the one truth. Now, who's deceived? Who's deceived? The person who's only seen one truth? Been in that cave staring up at the wall as people are feeding him images, right? If you've only seen those things, then you are truly deceived. And so it's so important for us to just be critical thinkers and just scrutinize the things that are being fed to us. And we've talked a lot about that over time. Remember what old Job was told from the Lord when he began to question the Lord and the Lord's motives and those kind of things. I love what is being said to Job. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me," the Lord says to Job. Oh, that'd stop you in your tracks, wouldn't it? Okay, Lord, whatever. Go ahead, talk to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. A little sarcasm there, don't you think? Surely you know, don't you, Job? Obviously you know everything, don't you? And so often we're that way when we think we know everything. We think we have all the answers. Oh, I've gone to school. I got a PhD. I know all this stuff, right? That's the funny thing about folks with PhDs, no offense, obviously. They've got a PhD in one area, but they think they know everything about everything a lot of times. Even if you don't have a PhD, often as human beings, we get to a place in life where we just think we know everything and we're not willing to set aside our own understanding and try to see, am I being deceived? Am I not seeing things clearly? Do I have a deception? Do I have scales on my eyes? Those kind of things. Surely you know, or who stretched out the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened, or who laid its cornerstone? And, we can look at that passage and say, well, yeah, Job, he was, 3 or 4,000 years ago. Obviously, he didn't know anything, but today, we've got a lot more knowledge and we know what the foundations of the earth are. Sure, we understand its measurements. We understand the line that's been stretched out upon the universe, and we know how big it is, and we know how far the stars are away, right? And that is certainly in the scientific world, they would look at Job and say, well, he didn't know, but we know. But I want us to look at that verse and say, can God only say that to Job, or can he say that to us still? Do we not put ourselves in that place of understanding of, we don't know everything still. We don't know everything. There's no way we can know, is what I get out of that verse. God is saying, I think, in a lot of ways here, if you really understand what he's getting at here, is you just don't know. You don't know what you're talking about. You might know a little bit, but you don't have the full story. I was kind of chatting with a guy on YouTube this week. He's been listening to our Wednesday night study, and he said to me, I know the earth is flat. I absolutely know it. I've been sending balloons up to 22,000 feet and it's completely flat. And he just came out really, really strong of just saying, absolutely, the earth is flat. I know it for sure. And I said, well, I tend to agree with you. But if we say that, aren't we doing the same thing the scientists are doing in light of this verse right here? Aren't we saying we have all of the knowledge of the entire universe? We have all of the knowledge of the entire world. And, we've studied it all and there's nothing we don't know about it. And therefore we can come right out and say, and I was trying to just get him to temper that a little bit and say, well, yeah, obviously there's great evidence to point us in that direction. And I tend to agree with everything you're saying. But at the same time, can we be guilty of having the Lord say this to us? Are you darkening counsel by words without knowledge? and asking that question to us, surely you know. And again, I think it just calls us back to be humble and just to try to seek the Lord on it and not be so prideful to say, as the scientists do, hey, there is no God. That's what they say. I mean, they confidently say there is no God. And I told this to this guy on the YouTube site. I said, you know, for them to say that, they have to have ultimate knowledge of the entire universe. For them to say there is no God accurately, they have to have complete knowledge of everything in the entire universe to know there's no God. And again, for us to say, because we've done a few little experiments, to say we absolutely know what the earth looks like and what it's shaped like and how it's measured out and all these things, you know, again, I'm just counseling us to, or cautioning us to just be observant of what is being said to Job here. Interesting. The School of Athens is the name of this portrait that is done here back in the Renaissance period. And it was Raphael's masterpiece, the perfect embodiment of the classical spirit of the Renaissance. And what he was trying to say in this picture is, what if all of the greatest philosophers and purveyors of knowledge throughout all of human history all lived at the same time and they could talk to each other, and what would they say to each other and those kind of things. And it's interesting, as you see in the very center under the arch there of that photo, or that portrait, you have Plato on your left and his pupil Aristotle on the right. And you can't really see it in this picture. I'm going to show you a clearer one in a minute, but Plato is pointing up and Aristotle is pointing kind of down to the earth, or he's saying right here. So Plato's saying it's up, Aristotle's saying it's down, it's here, it's on this earth, it's down to earth, is kind of the idea of what he's saying. And it goes along with their philosophy at that point in time, and it really started a rift where Plato believed that he had a theory of forms which basically believed, and I'll just read it here, Plato's gesture toward the sky is thought to indicate his philosophy that the real world is not the physical one, but instead a spiritual realm. And then it goes on, it says, conversely, Aristotle's hand is a visual representation of his belief that knowledge comes from experience. Empiricism, as it is known, theorizes that humans must have concrete evidence grounded in the physical world. And so what we can deduce by that picture, and I'll just give you the better photo here, that is really the argument that we're dealing with still today. As the Renaissance era, they said, hey, let's look back to that classical period. Let's look back. What was Plato saying back then? What was Aristotle saying? We've been dealing with Christianity for the last 1,000 years. Let's go back to what those guys were saying before Christianity. What was Aristotle saying? Well, Aristotle was saying, it's in the here and now. It's in the material world. Truth can be found empirically by concrete evidence and our rational minds and our ability to figure things out. Not the revelation of God, not the spiritual world. There is no spiritual world. That's not something we should look for wisdom in. We shouldn't look for wisdom in the revelation of God. We should look for wisdom and knowledge here in the physical material world. And of course, that's where this all started. As they began to say, toss out revelation, let's look at rationalism. Let's look at the material world. And of course, that's where the idea of evolution came from. That's where the idea of the Big Bang came from. It's where all these ideas came from. How can we begin with an understanding of how we got here without saying God started it, without bringing in that spiritual realm, without bringing in that revelation knowledge? Where do we start? Well, let's start with it just exploded, and here we are. And so, there's no way you can get past the understanding that their ideology specifically said, we're tossing out this information. We're only going to look at this and what fits this narrative from this point forward. We're going to toss out God, toss out revelation of God, toss out spiritual realm and anything that has to do with the spiritual realm, and we're only going to focus on the rational, physical world that we live in. And that's where this great deception began. And so I think it's incredibly important for us to understand that and to remember that when we think about ideology. Because yes, being rational and being empirical and all those things are good. There's nothing wrong with that. But to say that I have all the knowledge, that our puny human minds can figure it all out and rationally understand it and come to an ultimate declaration of what is true and what is not true, what is real knowledge and what is not real knowledge, by throwing out God and his revelation. I mean, it's just an amazing declaration that is being made. And it's being made not because of science, it's being made because of ideology. It's being made because this is what I believe. I don't believe in God. I don't want to believe in God. I won't believe in God. I reject anything that has to do with God. I'm going to believe in the material world, what's right here and now. And I'll toss out anything that contradicts that narrative. Does that sound right? Does that sound like what's going on in our world today? It does, doesn't it? And so Job, after the Lord chews his butt for a little while, he comes back and he said, well, you asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? And I just want to say, I've uttered what I do not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I do not know. You're right, Lord. I don't know what I'm talking about. Never mind. Forget I even said it, kind of a thing. But anyway, that's how I want to kind of set up these talks that we're doing from here on out. I'm going to bring in some of the philosophical, because I think it's hugely important for us to understand the whole discussion. Bring in some of the theological, and then I'd love to get you guys up here and talk about some of the things that have really spoken to you, things that you've seen, things that you've heard, things that you've understood. Yeah, how do you do that? Unless you got a cable attached to your back with a 70-pound pack on your back. Isn't that amazing? Watch how he gets up. That gravity on the moon's great, isn't it? I'll just throw myself up.
Yeah.
That's a heck of a push-up right there. And back in the day, back in the 69, I guess they might have just thought, well, people will just think that's what gravity does for you, or a lack of gravity on the moon. But you start really looking at it, and now what we know about movie sets, that's how they control people. They got a wire and they just pull them up. So it's an amazing thing. But that's all I have. I just wanted to kind of get us in a mindset of understanding this deception and the zeal that goes on. And our brother, I think, has a great presentation for us that deals with that kind of ideology. I'm so blessed that you went in the direction you did. He's going to talk about the history of NASA, and it's all about ideology. It's all about zeal without knowledge. And so, brother, come on up and share what you got with us.
Okay. Okay. All right, so we'll start way back in the turn of the 20th century rather, and Nikola Tesla. So he was the whole space thing. We're just trying to figure out where it started, and people wrote about it a long time ago. But in I guess it was 1896. He came up with this electrical wireless transmission system that he thought he could contact Mars with. And he actually worked here in the Springs. He did a lot of his work here, and this is where he thought that he had received signals from Mars, because he kept getting these repetitive signals, and they would stop as soon as Mars would set in the night sky. So he said, oh, that's got to be Mars, right? So that began kind of the SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. People started talking about that, especially with the advent of the radio. It kind of just went everywhere at once. And that's him in his lab working with electromagnetism and all kinds of cool stuff there. So then flight came, where we started flying around. The Germans came up with the Zeppelin balloon, the turn of the century also, and they scared everybody really bad with this thing, actually. So World War I, they used them to bomb the Allies and the U.S., and everybody was scared to death. They were like, we got to get up there too, so we can deal with these people. So this was that was around World War I. Of course, it came out at the turn of the century. So in 1915, there became the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in Langley Field, Virginia, and basically they really dealt with just how to keep planes in the air and how to, like, aerodynamics and stuff, basic stuff. And one of the members was Orville Wright, which was pretty cool. And so this was when the Germans were causing a lot of havoc there. But so after the war, the U.S. was determined to be the first to the stratosphere, which they didn't have really any competition to do that. And so they started sending Army guys up there, and I just thought this was a cool picture. I don't know if this is what they used to get up there, but I thought that was pretty cool. So Army Major Rudolph Schroeder back in 1920 went up to about 33,000 feet. And in 21, another Army Major, John McCready, went up to about 35,000 feet. So they were on their way, and nobody was doing that at the time. And then in the 20s, there was this guy named Robert Goddard, and he created and built the first liquid-fueled rocket with the help of some of his friends. I wrote their names down, but just really, there are a lot of consonants going on there, so we're not gonna deal with too much of that. So, but in 1926, they started firing these up in the sky. They did that all the way up until 1941, and their rockets they went about speeds of over 500 miles an hour and altitudes of about 1.5 miles. So Goddard became known as the father of modern rocket propulsion. And he got his ideas and his love for space by reading War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. And he would later go to work for NASA and work with this fella here named Wernher von Braun, and they developed the Saturn V and the V2 rockets for the program, the space program. So 1933 came around and Russia got involved. They wanted to be up in the stratosphere too, and they called it the Race to the Stratosphere between the U.S. and Russia. So their whole fight started pretty early there, And they actually had the dig race before the space race, which was who could dig to the mantle first, and then they realized that's not going to happen. They got about 7 miles before their tools stopped working. They couldn't drill any further. So, moving on, we're going to go to talk about Nazis, because they played an integral role in all this. So, a guy named Hans Kammler, he was a civil engineer, and he also designed the concentration camps for Germany during the war. Real bad dude. But he was a very smart guy. There's a crazy picture of him right there, watching something go up in the air, I imagine. And he also moved the Nazi rocket program underground in the 40s after the U.S. Army received a letter that from somebody who they believed about the power and all this stuff about the Nazis' rockets, like what they could do, the power. They could fly 200 kilometers plus. It's about the time the intercontinental ballistic missile also came onto the scene here. Wernher von Braun worked with him in the program also. That site was called the Peenemünde test site, and after the U.S. bombed that, he was responsible for actually taking the whole program underground, where they started developing other kind of things like UFO technology. And Hitler was a big occultist, so he used channelers to get a lot of this information about anti-gravity and stuff, and they were pretty successful actually. So who's to say? I don't know how they got all this information, but they developed UFOs. There's another one, pretty scary looking thing there with looks like a tank gun on it. So Hans Kammler also, I was telling Glen about this, Dr. Strangelove. This character, Peter Sellers played, Dr. Strangelove, was based on Hans Kammler. He was just a crazy Nazi who liked to destruction and all that kind of stuff. But oddly enough, this film was directed by one Stanley Kubrick. And his name keeps coming up over and over as far as the space program.
Did you say Kubrick?
Stanley Kubrick, yeah. And of course, there was this guy, Werner von Braun, really smart guy, got his PhD when he was 22. And then immediately after that, he joined the Nazi Party as a civilian. Worked with Kammler in the rocket program there. You can see him. He always wore a suit. He was never in military attire because he was a civilian. There he is with a bunch of Nazis during the war. Arthur C. Clarke. He wrote a bunch of books. He was a sci-fi writer. He wrote 2001: Space Odyssey, which was then directed by Stanley Kubrick. And but he also wrote a letter to Wireless World magazine back in 1945 about his idea of satellites and how they could advance global communications and all the good stuff about all that. And here he is with Mr. von Braun at a party, having fun. These people were kind of tight-knit, so they all, hung out with each other. They all had the same ideas. Most of them were occultists. Quote kind of speaks for itself. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And he invented the communication satellite. So anyway, the Nazis lost the war. Most of the military personnel were either captured or killed, but the scientists were of great interest to Russia and the U.S. So there they are after the war, putting their flag up there. And these are the scientists. What happened was Russia and the U.S. kind of split the scientists up evenly amongst them. Half went to Russia, half went to the U.S. Britain was kind of left out. They didn't get any scientists. So that was Operation Paperclip. That's a documented fact there. And so they went to work with the space program, doing other things in the scientific community in both countries. Then came Sputnik. This is, I guess, some of the Nazi scientists that went to work with Russia came up with this idea, which was a total joke. This was in 1957. These are my opinions, too. I think it's a total joke. If you look at it, Sputnik was this size, and this was some guy tinkering with it. And when Sputnik was launched, the only person on Earth allowed to track Sputnik from space was Stalin's girlfriend, because he was in power at the time, and that's a true story. I learned that in my research. And then came NASA. So the U.S. was like, well, we got to get something going here. So they came up with NASA, which absorbed NACA, which was the National Advisory Committee of Aeronautics. So that kind of just was absorbed into NASA. And they tooled around with big inflatable satellites and stuff like that. But there was another agency born that year that had a lot to do with what's going on, and that was ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. And we know it as DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So they added the D in 72, then in 93 they dropped the D, and then 96 they put the D back in for whatever reason. I don't know why. They couldn't decide whether they're not, they wanted that, I guess. But then the space race was on. So it was Russia and the U.S. We talked about the dig race. That didn't end well. So they took it up to space because they knew they couldn't do anything on Earth. So they were like, well, let's go see who can go high up into space. And we're going to talk a little bit about Jack Parsons. I just saw there were some interesting facts about him that I thought were, as far as pop culture stuff, he was very, very influential in pop culture. He was born Marvel Parsons, and they say that Tony Stark of Iron Man was based on this guy because of the rockets and stuff, but their roots were all in the occult. Jack Parsons, he developed an interest in engineering when he was young. He was a really smart guy. He was kind of a self-taught chemist. He didn't have any formal education. Worked making nitroglycerin in a factory as a young guy. Then he decided to go into rocketry. So he was very involved in that. So yeah, and as an older guy, he kept making nitroglycerin when he needed money to support his projects, his experiments and stuff. Well, Goddard created the first liquid-fueled rocket, but he did these liquid fuel rocket tests. And in 1936, on Halloween, in Roswell, New Mexico, at the Devil's Gate Dam, he fired up his first rocket there. And he did that a bunch.
What year was that?
That was in 36. But he was also very, very into the occult. He followed this guy right here, Aleister Crowley. And Aleister Crowley was a very influential member of the occult. He was in the Ordo Templi Orientis, or the Order of the Temple of the East. He created a religion called Thelema, which was, I guess, means to wish or to wish into existence, you know. So that was his only law was do what thou wilt. He did, you know, that was the only law. So there were no laws, I guess, apparently. So yeah, and he was a real peach. So he charged himself with the mission to bring humanity into the age of Horus, and Horus was the Egyptian falcon-headed weirdo-looking guy. But Parsons used to recite Crowley's Hymn to Pan while doing his static tests on his Giotto rockets, which are jet-assisted takeoff rockets. This was in 1941. And he was good friends with a guy named Frank Molina, who created the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So this was their, you know, we were talking, this one guy here last week was talking about sigil magic. So just, they all have signs and symbols and sigils and stuff that they use. Aleister Crowley also said he was personally responsible for World War I. So whether that's true or not, he had something to do with the sinking of the Lusitania, which brought us into the war. So, and Jack Parsons hung out with L. Ron Hubbard, who wrote Dianetics and was the creator of Scientology, and they would go to the desert with each other and do rituals and, you know, fire rockets and do drugs and stuff, but mostly it was drugs and rituals. And so yeah, he was, there were all these guys that we all know about, but they were all hanging out with each other and doing this stuff. But anyway, Jack Parsons became a high priest of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, and which really kind of, as his job when he was working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, they fired him because they were like, that's just some crazy stuff. We don't want to have anything to do with that. So they fired him. This was McCarthyism era, so they thought he was a spy for Russia. So he could no longer work doing that. He ended up dying at 37 in a laboratory fire at his own house, presumably making rocket fuel or nitroglycerin or something. But he wanted to bring the female Messiah, Babylon, to Earth. That was his mission in life. He wrote a bunch of stories about it and stuff. So I think the important thing is that, like, a lot of these people that dealt with the space program and the beginnings of the space program, they were all occultists. They believed in the magic of bringing forth their reality to Earth through rituals and stuff like that. So I think that's important to note. And his buddy Frank Molina, that we talked about, he's a mathematician. He's a pretty hardcore scientist, the guy on the right there. Hardcore communist. Did I say scientist? He was a hardcore scientist too, but he was also a communist. So these guys were no good. It's about the time the Chinese space program started too, with a guy named Hu Xin, who was a rocketeer, and him and Molina worked a lot on rocket propulsion, stuff like that. So that's kind of when China entered the space program there too. But so back to von Braun, with the help of these guys here, he was a very influential figure in NASA, but also Walt Disney. They were good buddies. Walt Disney. And Walt Disney used his platform, which was TV and media and stuff, to put Wernher von Braun on all the TVs across America to tell us all these stories about how great it would be to go to space and have space stations. And
Was he an occultist as well?
yeah, very much so. He was, as a young guy, he was in the De Molay, which is like a group that,
Job's daughters.
stuff like that, but Freemasons for kids, basically. So they pushed going to outer space and all the possibilities that came with it on the American people. And then, you know, we get to 1961 when that famous speech Kennedy made about going to the moon and how we got to do it because we have to establish dominance on the moon. And then we got the missions they started up in NASA. The Mercury missions were the first ones. And all the Mercury missions were suborbital, meaning they only went about 60 miles above the Earth, hung out around there and came back. And yeah, crazy, huh? And so sigil magic, again, they've all got their signs or logos or symbols for, this was the Mercury logo, the Mercury mission logo. And then 62, they started doing Earth orbiting missions, which were 99 to 1,200 miles from Earth. That's what's called Earth orbiting missions. And so they did a bunch of that. I might be leaving a bunch of stuff out. This is what fascinated me about it, and I thought the timeline was important too, but I mean, let's see here. So Yeah, that's Mercury. And then Gemini started.
That's
Yeah, so those were all Earth orbiting missions. There was 99 miles up to 1,200 miles from Earth. So that's what 1,200 miles above Earth looks like, apparently. And there was other cool things going on about this time. These were, I think the Gemini was from 65 to 66, but also they were working on other stuff like the SR-71, the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. And that was really awesome technology. So they were using this technology they're creating to make awesome weapons of war and planes and stuff like that too. So the SR-71 went about Mach 3 and flew up to about 85,000 feet and is still the fastest plane on Earth. And it came out over 50 years ago. So now we get to the Apollo missions. And this was in 66. And they all started as Earth orbiter missions. They were getting worried, though. They were getting worried because JFK, long dead now, still said by the end of the decade we were going to get to the moon. So Walt Disney and Werner von Braun went on TV and said, we're going to the moon. And this is how we're going to do it. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to... That's him with JFK, I believe, before JFK was assassinated. And that's because that's a Saturn IV rocket. And so Werner von Braun comes on TV and he says, all right, we're going to the moon. A really heavy German accent, talking to a bunch of Americans about how they're going to make a movie. And this movie is going to be based in realism because they want to give us an idea of what it's like for them when they go to the moon. They said the only way they can do that, though, is to make a movie with everything, actual size, all this stuff, for our consumption, so that we'll know what it's like when they go to the moon. And he said, this is a snapshot I took from the video where he was saying that. And so he had a bunch of meetings with, Neil Armstrong was in the meetings, a bunch of engineers, military personnel, builders, Hollywood producers, all kinds of people were in these meetings. So they drew it up. They got all their ducks in a row, I guess, and they hired this guy here to direct the movie. But their intention was to show us this movie and then go to the moon, and then we'll all be like, oh yeah, that's right, that's how it is. And so, because he directed 2001: A Space Odyssey, and they saw that movie and they said, well, this guy can make things look absolutely real. This is the real deal, right? So they employed him, and again, to give Americans a better idea of what the actual mission to the moon was going to be like. So here he is with a little lander. That's him hanging out on set there. Here is... So this is an actual still of them on set, cleaning it up, getting ready for everything, getting rid of all the foot tracks and stuff. There he is on set. And those are those wires you were talking about. Mm-hmm. So they did this, and then made this movie. There he is looking at footage. There he is looking at some more footage. And then it happened, and then they went to the moon. That's Nixon on the phone with the Apollo 11 astronauts, talking to them, and he was asking them how everything's going up there. They said, very good, Mr. President, all this stuff. If you look a little closer, though, as he's on the phone there, on the wall, there's a picture, and that picture, if you zoom in a little bit of it, it's a picture of the Earth from the moon. So that's a little weird. So they came back. There was all this pageantry, all this stuff. Nixon, they had a bunch of people get together. Nixon stood there, and they all said the Pledge of Allegiance while the astronauts were in a little pod there, a little presidential pod hanging out, waving at everybody for some reason. That's kind of weird, though, isn't it? And so what happened? They went to the moon. They came back and all this stuff. So, and they went back several times until 1972 just to like play golf and ride around in dune buggies and stuff like that. And they didn't do anything really from 72 until 81, but in that time there were a lot of people coming out, voices, scientists, people like Carl Sagan, who would tell us how insignificant we are. We don't, the earth is, they're right, the earth is a ball. We're just the pale blue dot. And I don't know exactly the entire quote, but we exist in a dust cloud, and that's us right there. So that really, they captured the minds of everybody. They captured our imaginations. And then 1981, they created the shuttle program, the Space Shuttle Columbia. And that was kind of a game changer. You could use the shuttle over and over again. It wasn't, so they did that for 20 years. And then in 86, the Challenger mission, where they all died.
Or did they?
And we all saw it. I was in second grade. My teacher wheeled in the TV on the big thing there, and she said, "Oh, they're about to take off." And we all sat and we watched, and then that happened. And then she just got the TV and wheeled it out of the room, and said nothing else about it. So some average people, Sally Ride, she was just a teacher, and some of the other people. But apparently they all had twins, because I think 3 of them had twins. But these are older people that look exactly like them, they're living today, living normal lives. So there's talk that maybe they didn't die. But then Columbia, and that was the same Columbia shuttle that was created in 81. In 2000, or 2001, I guess, it exploded, and everybody on that shuttle died too. But then they came up with the Hubble telescope, and that was launched in 1990. And sending pictures back again, just to kind of reinforce the idea that I think I know what you're saying. I'm thinking the same thing. You don't see curvature there, do you? I'm just kidding.
Who took the picture?
Took the picture.
Yeah, who took the picture?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, so they launched that. It was sending back crazy pictures, nebulas and quasars and all kinds of cool stuff.
I saw that on Star Trek.
Yeah, that's possibly that was a dangerous field they had to go through. But yeah, they just, this is happening. These are all, pictures that the Hubble telescope apparently took of just things that when I saw this picture originally when I was a kid, I was like, what is going on up in space? But they didn't leave out the stars this time. They got all the stars in there. So then we got the 1998 rolls around. The ISS goes up. And they send it up to low Earth orbit, where it remains today. They said if they ever decide to deorbit it and send it into an open expanse of sea as a shower of debris there, it won't hurt anybody. So what's crazy about the ISS, and a lot of people talk about this. They say, well, what about that big pool? What about that big Navy pool where they all go train? This is the biggest indoor pool in the world. So they send astronauts here to go train underwater. And they have all the pieces of the ISS in this pool. And so they say, well, they want to make sure that when they get up to the space station, they know what they're dealing with. So we send them underwater because they said that has something to do with the yeah. Okay, so they train there. And there was that Italian astronaut who almost drowned on a spacewalk. I guess that was in 2016.
On the actual walk?
No.
Practice.
It wasn't practice. It was an actual walk, and he almost drowned, and that kind of leaked out into the media. And they said water started filling his suit on the spacewalk, and that was an act. So that was just something for me. And I'm looking at this pool thing, and I'm like, wow, that's crazy how they spent all this money to put every part of the ISS in this underground pool. Well, it's just something to think about, for me at least. I spend my time thinking about stuff like that. So, that's where we're at today. We're just, we have the ISS. We have new companies coming out every day. We've got SpaceX making these huge rockets. I think that is the Mars rocket. And at some point, they're going to try to shoot that thing into space.
Buck Rogers.
They've got new technologies now. They can take off and land their huge rockets on a pad in the middle of the ocean on an aircraft carrier if they want to. They can send their... Uh-oh. I missed one. There it is. We can send a Tesla into space.
I'm no engineer, but I have read that if that car actually went into space in those conditions, I mean, the tires would have blown, the paint would have peeled, like, it would have been...
It would have gotten so cold you would have seen the cold
You'd have
on the
seen the
car.
cold,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So they've got all this cool stuff now. Blue Origin's another one. They're kind of competing for, to see who gets the most tax dollars to send their stuff up into space. Cool new spacesuits and stuff like that. But just like in the 70s with Carl Sagan, they have their guys nowadays that are following suit, telling us how insignificant we are, telling us how we have to go to the stars. We have to leave Earth if we're going to survive as a species. And so there's him, and there's him as an astronaut. It's pretty cool. And Bill Nye, of course.
What's that guy's name?
That was Neil deGrasse Tyson. That's Bill Nye.
Yeah, no.
And I just wanted to get the silliest picture of him I could find.
Probably not hard.
But the Wernher von Braun, the big thing about people like him, who were a part of the space program and told us something all these years, went on television, with Walt Disney, and told us about the reality of space, how we've got to do that. When we talked about this last week, what's on his headstone? Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork.
Whose headstone is that? Warner?
That's Wernher von Braun's.
Oh, okay.
He was the guy who created the V2 rocket.
So did he become a Christian?
I don't know. I didn't go that far looking into him, but I know that, you get to a certain age and you know that you're staring your own mortality in the face. And, I guess he made a decision to have that put on his tombstone, but...
All the bells and whistles no longer matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Van Allen belt, the Van Allen radiation belt, is like two big donuts that go from the poles of the Earth and wrap around the Earth, right? And it's super high radiation, but apparently the Apollo missions, they could do it. And there was actually an Apollo 12 astronaut that was interviewed and asked, what did you do about the Van Allen radiation belts? And he looked at her puzzled and said, well, I didn't know anything about it. I guess if they were there, we just went through them. But this is something they make a big deal about nowadays. Like, we don't have the technology to go through that kind of radiation, and we have to prepare. And of course, we lost all the telemetry data of the Apollo missions. There's all these things, So I just figured, I've never done this before, given a presentation. It's kind of fun, actually. But
Great job.
well, thank you very much. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with it. With NASA, the people that were behind the scenes of NASA, all the things leading up to it and where we're at today. And it's like, who knows? But, this whole suppressing the truth thing, there's something to it. So thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you,
All right.
Jason.
There you go.